Okay, I officially call the 31st meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance to order. Pursuant to Standing Order 83.1, we are continuing with pre-budget consultations 2010. I do have a motion from Monsieur Paillet. Monsieur Paillet, would you very briefly introduce your motion?
Oui, j'ai envoyé.
Yes, I sent a motion out last week, and following consultations, I would like to read the motion that the committee call witnesses, including the HSBC Bank, Don Johnston, former Secretary General of the OECD, the Canada Revenue Agency, and the Federal Department of Finance, to appear before the committee on the subject of offshore bank accounts whose holders are Canadian, in order to learn what measures will be taken by the Canada Revenue Agency to recover unpaid income tax that may have been hidden in these accounts, find out whether criminal charges will be laid against account holders suspected of tax evasion, and finally, ascertain Canada's strategy for combating against tax evasion. And Mr. Chair, I ask that this motion be studied rather quickly. I understand we have a full agenda, but I believe it's time to act. Thank you, Mr. Paillet.
On the floor, the motion is in order.
Thank you, Chair. I'm assuming it is, and my friend, Monsieur Paillet, has shared this with all of us, and we share his concern, and I thank him for bringing it forward. I would actually like to propose 3 additions to it that I feel, and I've shared with Monsieur Paillet, I think are actually will make it stronger, including Secretary General of the OECD. I would like to include after that the OECD itself, and I can give you the wording, as well as after have been hidden in these accounts, how the voluntary disclosures program has affected our efforts in this area. I think that's something we should look at. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. Let's bring witnesses forward to talk about what we've done and if it works or not. And then after suspected of tax evasion, I would like to suggest that we discuss the work of and Canada's involvement in the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes, and then end with the last clause. So I would propose those 3 additions, and I can share those with you, Chair.
Sure.
Okay, that amendment is in order as well. Any discussion on the amendment, Mr. Bryson, and then Mr. Mulcair?
Just a couple of questions. One is, why are we inviting the former Secretary General as opposed to the current? But also, it's the wording of this is a little confusing. It says former Secretary General of the OECD, comma, the Canada Revenue. The wording of it's a little confusing because Mr. Johnston is a former cabinet minister, and it's not clear here. Perhaps we should say representatives of the Canada Revenue Agency and of the Federal Department of Finance, because it may be confused that these were ministries that he held at one point or another. I think it's a little ambiguous. So perhaps we should say Mr. Johnston, former Secretary General, and then say as well as representatives of the Canada Revenue Agency, and I think that would clear up that because he was very helpful. But are we inviting anyone from the OECD currently? Yeah. Okay. Where's
my
sub-amendment? It's not on.
My amendment says after the OECD, it says the OECD, so representatives from the OECD themselves.
Okay. Does everyone have a copy of the amendment?
Yeah, okay, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
It's only okay.
Whoever that may be, Mr. Bryson.
From the
yes. Sure.
Plus, the list is not exclusive. If the committee wanted to invite other witnesses, it can choose to do so. Mr. Mulcair?
Monsieur le Président, j'avais...
Mr. Chair, I had an amendment similar to the one proposed by my colleague Ten Menzies. Given his understanding of this file, and I would suggest we add the former Minister of Finance, Michael Wilson's name on the list. So immediately after Donald Johnston, we could add Michael Wilson, who is very aware of that file. And so we'd have a former Conservative minister and a former Liberal minister. And Mr. Wilson, as we know, is very cognizant of the file. And the other thing is a matter of details. I don't know what it means when we say the OECD. We cannot invite the OECD per se. I mean, it represents dozens of countries, so that isn't clear to me. I think the idea is excellent in itself, but could we perhaps change the wording? And of course, we're not inviting the entire OECD Council to appear.
And this Canadian Revenue Agency and Department of Finance, we'd say representatives of the CRA, Department of Finance, and representatives of the OECD.
Alors, donc, ma seule suggestion, c'est d'ajouter le nom de Michael Wilson tout de suite après.
Therefore, my only suggestion would be to add Mr. Michael Wilson's name after that of Don Johnston.
Okay, Mr. Szabo.
Mr. Chairman, in my experience, when you get too specific with regard to witnesses not knowing whether or not they're available and, in fact, appropriate to the work done, that this list is really should be a little more generic, and that people will be called as necessary. But it would appear that the objective of the motion is to ascertain Canada's strategy for combating tax evasion, and that's a proactive as opposed to a historic review. I don't understand why the Honourable Don Johnson is here, but I'm sure there's many people who have in the past had some matters, and I think if the committee would accept it, is to just simply leave the OECD there, and it does say witnesses including, but not limited to. And I think as we see the need, because I could see this could take an awful long time if we're going to start to stray too far from the intent of what I read the motion is for. So I would propose simply leave it at OECD, drop the former Secretary General of OECD, which is sticking out there as a sore thumb, is the only person specifically named on here. And if you want to, the committee can seek and find out availability of the most appropriate officials from all of these agencies, and then bring them back to the committee.
Well, let's deal, I mean, the motion is been presented as such, the amendment's been presented as such. Mr. Mulcair has added a name and essentially a sub-amendment, so let's deal with it in that order, and then, Mr. Szabo, your point's been made, and we'll deal with that when we deal with the main motion. We have Monsieur Payet. Monsieur Payet.
Oui, juste pour préciser.
Yeah, just to clarify something. Perhaps we missed this last week, but Mr. Johnston made specific remarks concerning the situation at hand in this motion, and that's why we want to call him. And I also support the proposal by my colleague from Outremont to add Michael Wilson's name. Because to be too generic sometimes doesn't help us get anywhere.
Committee's direction, we'll start with adding Mr. Wilson, as Mr. Mulcair suggested. D'accord? D'accord? Then on Mr. Menzies' amendment, in terms of his additions, all in favor? All opposed? That's unanimous. And on the motion as amended, all in favor? Okay, opposed? That's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you. I will seek some guidance from members as to when they want to do the timing. As they know, we're in pre-budget hearings and quite busy with that, but we will obviously have to add some additional meetings this fall to accommodate the motion. Thank you all. I do want to thank our witnesses for their patience this afternoon. I appreciate that very much. We do have a 2-hour session here, and we wanted to have this session with a number of the chief economists with respect to our pre-budget hearings. We have with us here today, we have some from CIBC World Markets. We have Mr. Benjamin Tall, the Deputy Chief Economist. We have from the Conference Board of Canada, we have the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist, Mr. Glenn Hodgson. Le Mouvement de Caisse Desjardins, Mr. Bernard Brun, Directeur.
Mr. Bernard Brun, Director. Mr. François Dupuis, Vice President, Economic Studies. And finally, Laurentian Bank of Canada, Carlos Leitao, Chief Strategist and Chief Economist.
Each organization will have up to 10 minutes for an opening statement, and then we will proceed to questions from members. And we'll start in that order. We'll start with Mr. Tall.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to be relatively brief. I think that the real measure of intelligence is what you do when you don't know what to do. And I think that Bernanke in the U.S. and Carney here in Canada will tell you that they don't know what to do because that's the way they describe the situation. Both of them told us that the situation now is described as unusual uncertainty, which means that there is a significant room for error one way or another. If you look at the consensus, so-called consensus among economists, you will see that there is a wide range between the optimists and the pessimists. So even the finance minister admitted that there is a significant level of uncertainty as far as the economy is concerned. So the question is what to do when you don't know what to do. And the answer is, first of all, don't overreact and don't make mistakes. So I think that this kind of environment suggests that we should be prudent as far as the budget is concerned. You look at the U.S. economy and you see a situation in which the housing market there is really struggling in a very significant way. You look at the real estate market in Canada and you see that it's slowing down significantly. You look at China and you see that it's slowing. You see so many things that are missing at this point. You look at government money that was artificially stimulating the economy in the first half of the year. Now this government money is not available in both sides of the border. So to me, this suggests that the economy is going to slow down much more than it was expected 6 months ago. This means that we were going to face a shortage of revenues over the next 12 months with the economy growing by only 1.9% in real GDP and maybe 3.5% nominal GDP where you derive revenues from. So clearly we are entering a very, very, very challenging period as far as the economy is concerned. And it's not just Canada, it's the US, it's China, and definitely Europe. So it's a global slowdown that will have significant implications for the Canadian economy and the budget situation. Add to it the provincial shortcomings in terms of budget, and you see a situation why we should be prudent. What does it mean? It means, first of all, that the Bank of Canada should be extremely careful not to raise too much interest rates, not to raise interest rates too aggressively. Why? Because our consumers are stretched. The only reason, or the main reason, why the Canadian economy was able to perform the U.S. was the fact that monetary policy in Canada was extremely effective. You have a situation in which consumer confidence in Canada is only 20% below the rate we have seen during the happy days of 2007. In the U.S., it is 60% below. So you live in the U.S., you're not sure about your job tomorrow. I can give you a 0% mortgage, you will not take it. In Canada, you will jump on it. And that's why Canada was able to outperform, because whenever the Bank of Canada cut interest rates, we got much more stimulus out of it. And that's why, in the process, we had a situation in which not only did we have the best financial sector in terms of the ability to provide credit, but also the strongest consumer sector in terms of the ability to accept this credit. So we were shooting from both directions. In the U.S., they were not shooting at all, and that's why we were able to outperform. Monetary policy in Canada was extremely, extremely efficient. The problem is that in this process, we have accumulated a significant amount of debt. The debt-to-income ratio in Canada is 146%. This is a major challenge. It means that as a society, we became much more sensitive to any economic shock, including higher interest rates. I estimate that we are 40% more sensitive to higher interest rates than we were 10 years ago. And that's why the Bank of Canada should be very careful.
Okay. You finished? That's it? Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Tall, for your presentation. We'll now hear from Mr. Hodgson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In just a few minutes, I thought I would do three things today. Describe what I think is the context for good fiscal policy. What does a good fiscal framework look like? Then talk a bit about the economic outlook, which I think, as Benjamin just said, is really fraught with uncertainty right now. and then talk about the future course for fiscal policy. So very briefly, what's good fiscal policy to the Conference Board and to me as an economist? It's a policy that really manages fiscal balances over the cycle. In the good times, you run balanced budgets, if not surpluses, and pay down debt. In bad times, you actually are able to step up by virtue of that strong position and provide fiscal stimulus. I think Canada is really a shining example of good fiscal policy over the last, say, 10 to 15 years. The fact that we paid down debt from sort of 1994, 1995 until 2008 gave us a lot more latitude than countries around the world to add stimulus without a big burden for our taxpayers on a going forward basis. So in many respects, by being ultra Keynesians in 2008, 2009, we did the right thing. We got the balance right between fiscal and monetary policy, and we're through it. We've seen the growth recovery in Canada for a year now. We've seen employment return to more or less where we were going into the recession. That's all good news. Going forward, it's going to be much more difficult times. But I do think that we're now in a period where we have to have a medium-term plan to get back to fiscal balance, and I'll come back to that. Secondly, on the economic outlook, it's a very choppy period. We're entering a period where there's both structural change going on globally, with the rise of China, India, and Brazil as the new centers of global growth, and all the challenges that still remain in Europe, in Japan, and in North America. So the balance of global growth is really switching now from the industrial countries where it used to be based to a world where we're going to rely a lot more upon China, India, Brazil, emerging markets as sources of growth. There's still uncertainty in financial markets, in Europe in particular. Japan has the highest debt GDP ratio in the world right now at about 200%, and I see bad things coming down the road in Japan. Within North America, it's obvious that the United States has gone through a very difficult period. After a financial crisis, it's very hard to see a return to sort of stable, sustainable growth going forward. And the lack of consensus in the United States on what the right policy framework is going forward is adding to the uncertainty. So we're going through a really difficult period as a global economy. We are the shining light, I would argue, amongst industrial countries. Canada is clearly in better shape than almost anybody else in the world, but it's not going to be easy. As a consequence, we're right now in the midst of actually slowing down our forecast for growth in Canada this year, next year, and going forward. And that's going to present a big challenge for budgets. Whomever is in office, federally, provincially, and cities, is going to face a challenge because the strong, sustained growth that we normally have coming out of a recession just won't be there. Growth of 3% will be a good year. More likely growth of sort of 2.25%, 2.5% is the kind of world we're going to live in for the next 18 months. But then I come back then to, okay, what about fiscal policy on a going forward basis? I strongly believe that, in fact, fiscal stimulus has done its job now. We're going to see the stimulus program ramping down. We are seeing slow, it's not strong, but sustained growth from the private sector. And I think we reached a point where we have to withdraw the fiscal stimulus from our system and have a plan to get back to balance over, say, a five-year period. I also think, though, that we have to build shock absorbers into our fiscal plan. We have to use conservative assumptions planning because we're not going to see nominal income growing at 7-8% on a going forward basis. And in the budgeting itself, and we had a chance to meet with the minister this morning, and one of the comments that I made is that we should be rebuilding shock absorbers right into the budget. Go back to a period of having reserves built into the budget, simply because there is so much uncertainty out there, and things can move so much in a period of time that I would like to see the federal government with a bit of a absorptive capacity inside to sustain any future shocks to the financial system, to U.S. growth elsewhere. So you pull all that together, it also means that we're probably going to have to rely more upon monetary policy in the United States and elsewhere in the world than on fiscal policy to deal with any of these shocks as they come along. So pull all that together, I'm looking at a sort of 3 to 5 year plan to get back to balance, relying more upon monetary policy as the means of dealing with shocks to growth, and really planning for balancing the budget by about 2015. I'll wrap up by saying I wrote a commentary this summer which seemed to attract a little bit of media attention, talking about the government being slightly ahead of plan when it comes to balancing the budget. We still believe that. I said up to a year, it may be a little less than a year, but I do think the government really should be aiming at getting back to a balanced budget position sometime about 2015.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hodgson. We'll now go Monsieur Dupuis, s'il vous plaît.
Oui. Mr. Dupuis? Yes, good afternoon. As you know, we had a recession which was an atypical one, and the recovery is just as atypical. The financial crisis left a deep impact in a number of countries. And following the public investment in many industrialized countries, we believe that over the past summer, we'd light a flame and the private sector would take over from the public sector. But finally, that wasn't exactly the case. Economic growth rates remain quite weak according to historic standards. I think the explanation for that is that we're in a rebalancing mode. The global economy was quite euphoric for the past 10 to 15 years, and many industrialized countries are currently rebalancing their finances. When you look at the government, much has been spent, and now we're in a period of rebalancing. And even the contribution from a number of countries will become negative in terms of their economy. We see consumers in the U.S. and American households are increasing their savings rate and trying to reduce their debt levels. The statistic shows that from 140% of GDP in terms 140% revenue to GDP, we're now down to 125. So there is a rebalancing underway. When you look at the household sector, they're stuck at historic lows. And it will take some time for the housing market to get back on track in the U.S. And so in the U.S., they're waiting for some positive news. You know, small and medium enterprises create most jobs, and currently there's very little demand for credit, even though U.S. businesses are in a good monetary position. They're quite profitable. However, it seems that they're taking a wait-and-seek position. And so that's quite concerning for the next couple of years. And that, in a way, explains the economic context is different this year and will be different over the coming years. That is because there is a major rebalancing underway to come back to a healthier foundation. The current environment, as you know, is fraught with risk. There's risk of public debt. There's risk of the U.S. housing market, which could fall again. And there's also a great volatility in terms of the currency markets. We see that the current financial markets are quite skeptical in terms of the U.S. and global economy. And all that leads us to a very prudent context. And the outlook will be a bit under the long-term production capacity, with inflation which will remain quite weak over the coming years. And therefore, there might be a risk of deflation in certain cases. So the central banks have to remain extremely cautious, beginning here in Canada. I believe that it should be the end of the interest rate hikes. I think there will be a prolonged pause in those hikes in order to see how things do and how the Canadian economy will react in the face of the U.S. slowdown. Of course, Canada's economy is quite more sound, except for our exports. We saw our financial sector was quite stronger. Household debt was much smaller than in the U.S. So basically, our interior demand has done well. We've recovered all the jobs lost during the recession. Revenues are pretty good. So we have a labor market that is doing quite well, and we have a Canadian housing market that wasn't hit as hard as in the U.S. And we've even regained price levels pre-recession. So we are at risk, but we're not on an isolated island. So if the U.S. and the rest of the world face challenges, we ourselves might face the same over the next quarters, and that'll be a challenge for us. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dupuis.
Bonjour tout le monde. Merci de...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues say, but I would like to repeat what François has just said. That is that Canada is not an island. Therefore, what is happening abroad has major implications on what's happening in Canada. And 2009 and 2010, Canadian economy was much better than in the U.S. and Europe. That's because we had a monetary policy that was quite effective, as well as a fiscal support. And therefore, consumption was driven to the max. And so interior demand and consumption and the household sector basically absorbed the shock of the recession 2009-2010. I think we've gone to that extent to the max. Debt levels are quite high, and as Mr. Carney indicated in his speech in Windsor last week, future growth in consumption in Canada, including household sector, should be about at the same level as revenue growth. So we cannot continue to have an increase in expenditures over and above revenue increase. The household debt should basically plateau out, and henceforth consumption will contribute less to overall growth. So export markets, as has always been the case, become a driver for the Canadian economy. Unfortunately, as was indicated here previously, the outlook abroad, especially in the U.S., which is our principal trade partner, the outlook in the U.S. for our export markets aren't quite pleasing for 2010-2011. So it is in this environment that we are in now, and that's what we have to deal with. I believe our economic growth should be about 2 to 2.5% real GDP, very little inflation, perhaps 1% inflation. So a nominal GDP increase, perhaps 3.5%, 4% in the best of scenarios, and we have to work with that when we conduct our financial planning for the future. That's basically what I have to say now. Thank you.
Round being 7 minutes. We'll start with Mr. Bryson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to our witnesses today. My first question is on the issue of personal debt. And one of the areas where we do not compare favorably internationally is in the area of personal debt levels in Canada, and I believe the average is $42,000 per Canadian in terms of personal debt, and that ranks us among the highest in the industrialized world in terms of personal debt. That combined with the federal debt and then also provincial debt numbers creates a more troubling figure. In fact, we're often compared as a country, our debt GDP numbers only compare typically our federal debt numbers with other countries that are in many cases unitary states or states wherein other levels of government are not able legislatively to take on the same levels of debt. But if you combine federal debt, provincial debt, and personal debt, i.e. gross debt within Canada as a percent of GDP, the Canadian figure is 81.6% of GDP, gross debt as a percent of GDP. The U.S. is almost at the same level. It's about the same level, 82.3% GDP. So those figures are kind of troubling, particularly considering that gross debt as a percent of GDP, in terms of gross debt as a percent of GDP, we're worse off than countries like Germany and the UK. I'd appreciate your thoughts on that, because there's only one taxpayer, even though there may be a number of states that can take on debt, and ultimately we all have to collectively deal with the realities of paying for health care and social investment and the rest of it. So I'd appreciate your thoughts on the risk that this level of indebtedness comparatively represents to Canada.
Let me respond to that. Clearly, the debt situation in Canada has deteriorated. I'm talking about personal debt now, over the past 2 to 3 years, reflecting the fact that monetary policy was very effective, and that's the main reason why Canada was able to outperform, one of the reasons. However, you can talk about debt and you can talk about the quality of debt, namely, not all debt is created equal. If you look at the U.S., the debt-to-income ratio was more or less the same, but 33% of the mortgage market there was subprime mortgage, as opposed to less than 5% in Canada. I'll give you another number. Only 4.1% of households in Canada have less than 20% equity on their house and debt service ratio of more than 40%. So there is debt and there is quality of debt. I will be the first to admit that the debt situation in Canada is unsustainable and we have to see some deleveraging happening. We have to see the savings rate rising and we have to see credit going down, and it's starting. The question is to what extent the government should do something about it. My advice is no, not at this point, because the economy is already slowing. The market is taking care of itself. If you look at the housing market in Canada, it is already slowing down. House prices are falling. Mortgage activity is slowing down. Consumer credit is back to the levels we have seen in the recession in terms of a month-over-month rate of growth. So the market is already clearing. I totally agree that the debt situation is a problem. This is not the time to deal with it. A year or 2 years from now, if we see a rebound in credit and the housing market starting to rise again, that will be the time to take care of it. At this point, don't fight the momentum. The momentum is helping us now.
I guess, Mr. Price, my reaction is you just made the case for why the federal government should have a 3 to 5 year plan to get back to balanced budgets, because there is only one taxpayer, and some provinces are in far worse shape than the federal government. I'm worried about Ontario's structural deficit, for example. My fear is Ontario is going to get stuck with a structural deficit of at least $10 billion, maybe higher. We saw a very tough budget in Quebec put in place this spring because the Quebec government was well aware of the demographics working against it, the fact that it has to get back to a balanced budget by about 2014. So notwithstanding what Mr. Tal's comments, I do think that the federal budget did the right thing in terms of the structure, having a 5-year plan to get back to balance, because ultimately there is only one taxpayer. I don't think there's that ongoing need, for example, for federal stimulus in any form. I think we can allow monetary policy to do the job. If there's any slack required in our economy, it can be achieved through monetary policy. But I actually agree with you entirely that we have to be very conscious of the indebtedness personally, provincially, federally, and ensure that we have a plan to get back to reducing that debt burden over time.
Okay. Monsieur Dupuis wanted to comment. Monsieur Dupuis.
Well, in fact, I think you're right. The public and private debt in Canada is extremely high. However, when you look at other countries, we're not so bad off. But you also look at the quality of assets. I'm thinking in Canada, the assets are of a better quality than in other countries. And you also have to look at the public indebtedness and the amount of that is financed abroad. And perhaps we are less at risk in certain levels. But of course, that continued indebtedness and the low interest rates, and perhaps if we had a sudden surge in interest rates, as we saw a few years ago, many people would be at risk, and that would lead to a considerable shock to the Canadian economy. But I think it is not very probable that interest rates will increase considerably. So I think we should tell Canadians that they should decrease their debt levels as quickly as possible in the event that rates rise. But with regard to the federal government and the provincial governments, I think sound fiscal management is the best guarantee in the event of tough times or a recession, as we saw in 2008-2009.
The commodity-led recovery in Canada, if we assume that commodity demand from the emerging countries is going to remain or going to be quite robust on a secular basis for a long time, what's the risk to Canada of a very uneven recovery with upward pressure on our dollar and a continued crowding out of some of our traditional industries and some of our traditional economic heartland areas? I appreciate your thoughts on that risk and what that could mean for unemployment. Thank you.
Let's just get one, Mr. Letteo. Monsieur Letteo.
Yeah, thank you. Well, on the commodity side, certainly we still think that the economic prospects in emerging markets, particularly China, India, Brazil, are still much stronger than in North America or Europe. Therefore, their growth will be higher, demand for raw materials will be higher, so there should be some upward pressure on commodity prices, which will be good for Canada. After all, we do have a large natural resource base. The byproduct of that will probably be a significantly higher or a high Canadian dollar, close to parity. Now, we can open here a discussion that we've had for many, many years, about the productivity of Canadians, Canadian manufacturers, and high dollar, low dollar. But I think the economy here now is adjusting to a high currency. And we are going to end up with a manufacturing sector down the road that is fairly smaller than what it is now, but more efficient and more productive, or so we hope. That adjustment process is taking place elsewhere in Europe and in the United States. And I think the risk that I see for Canada is that we keep on saying, with some reason, that we escaped the worst of the recession, and we could be a little complacent, as Ben was mentioning earlier this morning. And we shouldn't be, because it's a scary world out there. So we need to be very productive and very efficient with a high dollar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bryson. Monsieur Paet, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, good afternoon. I agree with most of you when you say that the quality of the assets is important, and that talks to risk management. And if the debt is an internal debt, well, then there's a good possibility of a good return in terms of tax revenue. In the Desjardins document, and I'll have most of my questions for Desjardins, which submitted a brief, you talk about excessive indebtedness, but at the same time it is said that we have to rebalance the economy. I think that's something you indicated earlier. Yes, we can say 80%. That's astounding. But when you look at or compare with other countries, I hesitate to use the term excessive indebtedness. I do not share that perspective. And in a former life, with Mr. Letao, we discussed these matters on television, but I moved on. Nevertheless, with regard to Desjardins, in Part 2, you say that we should invest in human capital, and you talk about education. I fully agree with you. We're in a complete agreement on that. But I would ask you to carefully take into account the various jurisdictions. Here we're in the federal parliament, and I'd like to hear you on this. In Part 3 of your brief, you say that Desjardins has a very decentralized system and works in a coordinated approach, and you seem to say that the currency markets work very well in Canada, and if it's not broken, don't fix it. So I'm wondering if I'm going too far here, or is it the opinion of Desjardins movement that the securities market is operating very well and it shouldn't be changed? Well, indeed, in our brief we addressed that. With regard to the securities market on a general level, Desjardins is for cooperation among the various provinces and the various levels of government. And in that regard, we stick to that principle as well as for the securities market. The passport system works very well. Of course, the work has to be done on a continual basis. But it is by ensuring a coherent approach that we will come to a better framework. Time is of the essence. With regard to your proposals, in Part 5 of your brief, you say that the Government of Canada take action with regard to clean energy jobs and to be inspired by the American program. Are you referring to the former program to encourage the use of wind power, something the Conservative government has withdrawn from? And I believe we've already seen wind turbines in Quebec who will relocate in the U.S. Is this what you're getting at here? Well, no, not in particular, but we believe that action has to be taken with regard to those various programs. We haven't brought with us our environmental expert, but we believe action can be taken by the government. And in the following paragraph, you talk about greenhouse gas emissions. And you talk about a regulatory framework. You've probably met with the Minister of Finance today. Can you tell us whether Canada will, once and for all, establish regulations with regard to a carbon market? Well, there's a meeting that is planned over the next few weeks, and so we will see then if that will be placed on the agenda. So you're hoping, just like we are. Another point I wanted to ask you about was in your recommendations, you say that in recommendation 1A and 1B on page 4, that you would like there to be a cooperative investment plan created, as well as a cooperative development fund. Of course, those two paragraphs are part of the same sentence. I would appreciate perhaps a greater amount of details as to what such a cooperative investment plan or fund could be. Well, simply put, this is 2012 will be the International Year of the Cooperatives, and as announced by the UN. And so I think the cooperative movement should take that opportunity to put that on the front burner. So we're asking the government to implement certain programs, namely this Cooperative Development Fund and Cooperative Investment Plan. I could send you some more information. Yes, if you could send that to the committee, that would be great. Final question. For the people at CIBC, I don't have this with me, but a few years ago, you have published a document indicating that the Governor of the Bank of Canada had increased the interest rate a bit too quickly. I believe it was at the end of the 1990s, the beginning of the 2000s. And in order to follow the interest rate levels in the U.S., he had to backtrack. Do you believe that the latest interest rate increase of the Bank of Canada could have been put off a bit?
We probably could have skipped the September move, but that's not significant. That's only 25 basis points. I think that the message from here on is that we cannot deviate from the Federal Reserves in the U.S. in a very significant way. I think in the past it was a mistake, and I think that if we continue to raise interest rates at this point, independently of the Fed in the U.S., that will be a mistake again. So our call to the Governor of the Bank of Canada is to basically stay in neutral at this point and to basically see the situation getting a bit clearer before continuing to raise interest rates when the economy is giving us the green light. I don't believe that the economy is currently giving us the green light to continue to raise interest rates.
Merci.
Okay, merci. We'll go to Mr. Menzies now, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and let me be the first to congratulate you on your resounding support that this team shows for your leadership, and we look forward to a very successful and well-run committee going forward. So, congratulations, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for coming here today. I had the privilege of sitting with the finance minister when you appeared this morning, so I do have many questions from not only this morning's comments but from this afternoon's. Just very quickly, I want to read a quote. The opposition has been suggesting that we should stop our legislated and planned business tax reductions, and Jack Mintz wrote an interesting piece, and I'll just very much quote it, and I will, if I can actually continue speaking while others are interrupting, I will read you the quote and then ask whether or not you agree. The reduction in corporate taxes will improve neutrality by imposing similar tax burdens on businesses and result in some revenue loss due to profit shifting. These economic gains are substantial. Canadians, by and large, understand that the improved competitiveness of our corporate tax system has made Canada a much more attractive country for global investments. It helps bring down consumer prices since corporate taxes increase production costs. Greater capital investment induced by lower corporate taxes improves worker productivity and wages, as recent economic incidence studies have shown. Thus, corporate tax reductions help workers and consumers most. It is important for Canada to complete its reforms if it wishes to maintain an image that is a country open for business. Can I ask each one of you to comment on that?
Well, my light seems to have gone on, so I guess I get to start. We did a brief about 2.5 years ago talking about reform of the Canadian tax system, and I covered a lot of different things. But one of them was business taxation, and at the time we talked about reducing the corporate tax burden. Some other adjustments, for example, I think the step between the small business tax and the full corporate tax rate is too abrupt a step. I'd like to see a scale step. But as a general principle, for a country that's facing what's going to be a strong currency for a long time to come, we have to find ways to allow our business community to become more competitive going forward and to keep attracting our fair share of overall global investment. So we're on the record talking about reducing business taxation, of which the corporate income tax is one piece. Now, there's some other things in the brief. I won't go on about that now. But I think that responds to your question. We have to be very mindful that we're now competing in a world where our dollar is going to be more or less at par, frankly, from here to the horizon. We actually have the dollar breaking through par with the U.S. dollar sometime in 2011. And one can resort to specific tax measures or deal with the overall rate of corporate taxation. But I do think that we're on the right path, in fact, of reducing the burden. It'll require us to tax other things, such as carbon, but we can talk about that if you wish. But our brief is there for all to read, and we're certainly in favor of reducing the overall corporate tax burden.
Yeah, I would say that it's not only the dollar that is going up. I think that corporate Canada and SMEs in Canada are facing a significant challenge over the next few years. Why? Because the U.S. manufacturing sector is witnessing a significant structural change. We have seen a situation in which the manufacturing sector in the U.S., despite a recessionary American economy, the manufacturing sector in the U.S. is actually booming. All the improvement in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. is capital-intensive improvement. We are seeing basically a renaissance in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. They're able to penetrate emerging markets in a very significant way, and I think that corporate America has realized that the future is capital-intensive, and they are moving very fast on that. I see 2 or 3 years from now, when the fog clears, I see a much leaner but much more dynamic manufacturing sector that definitely will be able to compete in the U.S. The question is what we do here in Canada in order to basically maintain our market share, because at this point, actually, we are losing market share in the U.S., and if it's true that emerging markets is the future, we have to find a way, A, to get involved in the emerging markets, and B, to find opportunities in the global supply channels that the U.S. economy will be providing us. And at this point, we are not there. So I totally agree. What we need to help corporate Canada to face not only an expensive dollar, but also a changing manufacturing sector in the U.S. that will be much more competitive. Taxation is part of it, but we'll have to offset it.
Well, generally speaking, I do think that corporate income taxes should be kept at the minimum. And those that are already been announced and that businesses are already counting on, I wouldn't certainly not backtrack on it. But also, as Glenn pointed out, governments do need revenues. And if we do not raise it via corporate income taxes, then there has to be some other ways. And again, in general terms, if I were the Minister of Finance, which I'll never be, but if I were, I would keep corporate and personal income taxes at the lowest possible level, but I would raise consumption taxes, value-added taxes, the GST. Now, we know what's going on in British Columbia, so that's Canadians and consumption taxes. Canadians and consumption taxes are it's an explosive mix. So, I understand the practical problems of that, but I think corporate income taxes should be kept at the lowest possible level to keep our competitiveness.
Okay. Monsieur Dupuis, une minute.
Une minute. En fait, je suis d'accord avec.
Well, I agree with Carlos. I think it is important to know that it's businesses that create jobs, and that there has to be a structure that should be the most competitive possible. At the same time, earlier we talked about a scenario where you have a high level of risk and uncertainty. So I don't think much needs to be changed over the next few quarters and years. Given the uncertainty, I don't think it's the right time to make major changes.
So fair. The one comment to Mr. Leteo, we actually are seeing, through more people working, more small and medium-sized enterprises, starting businesses, maintaining businesses, actually more revenue from all of these without raising personal or corporate taxes. That's the plan, and we're certainly hoping that'll continue. But thank you for your answers.
Okay, thank you. Monsieur Mulcair, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to welcome the various representatives from the banking and cooperative sector. It's always with great pleasure that I listen to their informed viewpoints. I'd like to begin with a little anecdote which might explain why in the area of budgetary planning I'm very wary, because when Catherine and myself wanted to buy our first house in Cap Rouge, we went to see the Caisse Populaire there, and the manager told us, well, at 13.5%, that was unprecedented, and that we shouldn't take a mortgage of over a year because the rates wouldn't remain that low. And he was right. So we renewed the next year at 20.75%. So, you learn. I found the Desjardins movement's presentation quite excellent, but I have one question for you. I fully share your perspective in that we're going through an atypical situation. I'm very concerned because I've been seeing a slowdown over the summer and the loss of another few tens of thousands of jobs in the manufacturing sector. These are good-paying jobs. They're full-time jobs. They have pensions associated to them. When you talk about sustainable development, we often think about the environment, but if we don't want to leave our future generations in debt. And where you talked about a very low inflation, this called out to me. Historically, when you have a massive amount of debt, often the governments want to use inflation to refund the money to the Chinese, for instance, for one perhaps. What makes you so sure that inflation can remain so low? With 6,000 billion or 6 trillion, with $6 trillion printed since the beginning of the crisis, how will that money be reimbursed if it's not using inflation? Of course, we can say that we're better here in Canada than elsewhere, but concretely speaking, I don't understand how you can be so confident that we don't see massive inflation in the medium term as the only solution to reimburse that money. Of course, that's if you go back a few months when the governments were doing their expenditure plans, there was a great fear of inflation, and in 2009 especially. But I come back to the fact that demand was extremely weak. So in the short and medium term, it is demand in industrialized countries which is way too weak, and that is because of a rebalancing in various economic sectors. So even if the governments are holding a high level of debt, inflation is not at risk of ramping up because the economy is not running at full steam. In 5, 6, 7, 8 years, once we go through this rebalancing period, perhaps then there might be a surge in the inflation rate. But currently, that is not the case. I don't think anyone really sees a potential for that as we saw in the 1970s. Or too much inflationary pressure was created through a government intervention. And perhaps on a more technical level, economies are functioning under their capacity, so there's still a lot of slack in the economy. And so before that slack is taken up, that'll take a while. You said something with regard to the quality of assets in Canada. I look at the household debt compared to assets, and this is of great concern. The OECD says that we're one of the worst off in the world. Perhaps you can reassure me as to your definition of assets, because, well, I was comparing our situation with the subprime situation in the U.S. or the U.K. Here, loans are much more sound. It is in that sense that I was talking. Mr. Hodgson, is the level of household debt in Canada a source of significant concern?
I mean, we can see the rising personal debt levels, and it's a concern, and obviously that's why Minister Flaherty, Mark Carney have talked about this over the last year. But we are in a period where interest rates are low. People can afford to service them. That's part of the danger, is of course by keeping rates low, you're going to add to personal debt burden. At the government level, frankly, for the most part, we did the right thing over the last 15 years and got our government debt levels under control. Quebec being maybe the one outlier, even in Quebec with the kind of budget that the province had to put in place this spring. They have a plan to keep things under control. So I compare Canada to what's happened throughout Europe, to Japan in particular, and to what's happening in the United States, where you see debt levels rising, being ratcheted up federally at the state level within cities. And we are really a shining star by comparison, if we get our act together, if we actually keep doing the right thing. I am worried about Ontario. Because Ontario has gone through a very tough period where it was so deeply integrated into the U.S. economy, you know, as a manufacturing heartland. And with the shock therapy the U.S. economy has gone through, Ontario has now gone through the same shock. We've seen the shock in autos, other manufacturing sectors. Revenues fell off the edge of the table, added stimulus. So Ontario's in a fairly deep hole fiscally. And I do worry about the capacity, even with the best of intentions, to get back to balance. But overall, I'm not as worried about Canada as I would be about a lot of other places around the world.
Okay. You have 20 seconds? 20 seconds.
Mr. Tal, quickly on the question of the tax reductions for Canada's most profitable corporations. I know, as you do, that a company that hasn't made a profit didn't pay any taxes and doesn't get any help from a tax reduction. Is that still in your mind the next projected series of reductions of the corporate tax rate? Is that a good or a bad idea?
Well, I think that you can. I think it's a good idea to keep taxes to the minimum if you can afford it. I think that you have to offset it. As I said, the manufacturing sector in Canada will face major challenges over the next 2 to 3 years. I think that not only from a strong Canadian dollar, but also from an American industry that is restructuring as we talk in a very significant way. So we will wake up 2 or 3 years ago, 2 years from now, and we will see a manufacturing sector in the U.S. that we will not be able to compete with. So I think that if you can afford cutting taxes, yes, do it, but you must offset it by something else, be it carbon tax or anything else, including consumption tax. I'm not getting into the details now, but the direction is definitely to lower taxes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Merci. We'll go now to Mr. Zabo for a 5-minute round, please.
The seems to be a consensus that the one of the top priorities is to return to balanced budgets. And how you get there, some have indicated some possibilities. The reintroduction of contingency reserves, probably prudence reserves, et cetera, as was done under a previous government. But to do that, especially on the contingency side, I mean, you have to find something to cut to provide that in and still hold the same projected level of deficit. Still feel strongly that we should have contingency and prudence factors in there? Is that an element of getting our books balanced again?
I'll start. As a first principle, yes. How you do it, I couldn't agree more that it's difficult, although we did see fairly rapid federal spending growth all through the 2000 decade, and there has to be some scope for, essentially government we're at a point where government has to be rethought and have to think about words like productivity and efficiency and service delivery. But I think as a first principle, given how uncertain the world is out there...
I just got 5 minutes.
Yep, sorry.
Okay. Anybody else? Are we about the same? Let's talk about the U.S. dollar. I heard not too long ago that there are possibilities that the dollar could actually hit not just parity, but maybe as much as 105 sometime in the next calendar year. Given the export scenario for Canada, with about, 70% of our exports going to the U.S., obviously it's going to put significant pressure on our exports. How do you rebalance the economy between now and next year to take into account a premium on the Canadian dollar?
The short answer is you can't, and that's why this economy will grow only by 1.92%. That's why the budget assumptions of last year were too optimistic. That's why this economy will slow down. In a short period of time, you cannot reverse the situation. A parity is going to be very, very significant to the manufacturing sector. We are already losing ground in the U.S., and it will continue.
Exactly. Now, let's follow that through. What do you, and others can jump in on this. I think this is my last question anyway. What are we going to do in terms of, or let's put it another way, who is responsible for the pressure to move the Canadian dollar to parity and greater? Who is driving this?
The short answer is the market, but now that doesn't say anything. It says it all, but it doesn't say anything. Currencies are the most difficult thing to predict, particularly in the short term. Really, flip a coin, I have no clue. The Canadian dollar could go to 105, could go to 92 cents US. We are perceived as being part of the dollar bloc, so we tend to move along with the US dollar. We've seen some very strange movements in currencies over the past 6 months at least. So I really, in terms of who's responsible, I throw my hands up. And in fact, that is one of the biggest risks that we now face, is that there appears to be a bit of a currency war developing. We've seen the Japanese try to bring down their currency. We see that the Chinese trying to resist bringing up their currency. We see the Americans also not being too displeased with the lower currency. The Europeans don't know what they want about their currency. So the risk here is that we'll engage in competitive devaluations.
Okay. Last, I do have, but one last one. 1 minute, he said. Does everyone agree that we must have a shift away from income taxes to consumption taxes? And do you recommend to the Government of Canada that we increase the GST, HST?
I just said, yep.
Yep.
Je veux dire oui aussi, puis je vais répondre.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll answer the other question with regard to currencies. At the outset, I indicated that there was a substantial risk, and that substantial risk was increased volatility in currencies. And the U.S. dollar is heading downwards on a long-term basis, and the Canadian dollar will continue to rise in the long term. And so, all factors will make it for a strong Canadian dollar. So I think everything has to be put in place to help our businesses and our exporters. Thank you.
Just on his very brief question about consumption versus income taxes.
Yeah, we're on the record as saying you tax the most what you value the least.
Okay.
And consumption taxes and carbon taxes, frankly, would be the way I'd go.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay, thank you. We'll go now, Monsieur Carrier, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to meet with you. You are respected economic figures. I greatly appreciate receiving texts when people come and appear before our committee. Earlier, I understood that we don't live on an island. We depend on foreign markets, especially the U.S. market. And I'd like to explore something else. that is the housing sector. I think Dupuis or Mr. Letao talked about that, namely the slowdown in the U.S. Housing sector, which has affected us as well. Here in Canada, things have been maintained, but I think things are slowing down as well in the Canadian housing market. I'm wondering whether, because we are now in a pre-budgetary debate, in terms of economic decisions, has the government done enough for the housing market? I'm thinking about the CMHC, which is incurring billions of dollars in profits. Could those billions be used to build affordable housing? And there's a lack of affordable housing in Canada at present. Would that not be the kind of investment the government could make which would provide the biggest bang rather than investing in military aircraft which are built in the U.S., as well as in terms of job creation? Would it not be more effective to invest more substantially in affordable housing in Canada? I begin with Mr. Dupuis, perhaps. Well, that's a very good question. Of course, it all depends on the government's choices and the economic context. Of course, the poverty level in Canada remains quite high, especially after a recession. We see that food banks are empty and people face great needs. And there's a lot of pressure in various provinces to increase the affordable housing units. And so I'm not sure that should be done through the CMHC or through the government's budget, through more significant investments. I know some provinces have done that recently. I'm very sensitive to certain points of view that are not economic per se. I'm thinking about the environment, poverty issues. I am for an increase in the number of affordable housing units. Well, my question was, would it not be a more effective way to stimulate the economy by building more units? Well, I can't say the Canadian housing market is in great difficulty. You know, the residential housing market has boomed over the past few years. There was a slight pause during the last recession, but the prices today are higher than pre-recession. There has been a certain leveling off in the past few weeks, but that was following a great surge following the recession. There was a great demand from people who want to buy during the recession and who put off their purchases and who want to purchase before interest rates increase. I think the market is doing quite well, and I don't think it needs extra stimulus. I agree with Francois. The housing market as a whole is slightly heated. I don't think it should require more stimulus, but would social housing, well, investments in social housing be a good thing? Well, I think it has to be useful to society, but I don't think it should be seen as an economic stimulus. I think it has to be seen as whether it is useful for society, but not to stimulate the economy. 30 seconds left. Compared to government investments, you know, we're here to try to figure out what the government should invest in. Rather than investing in weapons that are produced abroad, would it not be better to have a major housing program? Should the government perhaps not take such a decision? No. Mr. Letao? Well, the decision is up to you to make. But could it not be an economic policy? Well, such a choice would have to be made whether it is aircraft or social housing, I think the choices have to be made on their own merit and shouldn't be seen as a way to stimulate the economy. You don't buy aircraft to stimulate the economy, and you don't buy houses or build houses to do the same. Thank you.
Chairman, and thank you for our witnesses coming. And I've seen a number of you before, and thank you for coming again. And I have a couple of sort of basic economic questions for you. And the one thing that always interests me is that 3% seems to be of GDP seems to be the that's growth. Like 3% is growth. Anything under 3% isn't really growth. Can you explain to me why 3% is the magic number? Well, we're still seeing growth at 2.5 or 2.6, 2.7. Some would say the economies are growing exponentially, say China, at double-digit GDP. It's out of control, and they can't keep up, and well, why is 3% such a magic number? Why can't we not be satisfied that we can control growth at 2.5?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that the new number will be 2.5. Yeah. So 2.5 will be the number because the potential growth of the economy is slowing down due to all the forces that we mentioned earlier, so I won't repeat it. So the potential growth of the economy or the speed limit of the economy is going down. This magic number is simply a function of two things, productivity and the increase in the labor force. And if you add them together, you got 3%. Now you will get a little bit less than that. So the point here is that the potential growth of the economy is slowing down. For China, the potential growth is not 3%, but 8% or 9% because of the fact that that's a very young economy. For a mature economy, it's 3% and now 2.5% after this recession. So that's just the way it works. And every year, you will overshoot this potential growth or not. And as far as the Bank of Canada is concerned, they basically have a model saying, okay, what's the potential growth? If you are below, you have to stimulate the economy or vice versa.
So you're relying on the Bank of Canada analysis to determine whether that 3% is the magic number or not, basically. But I've heard it since, well, I've been here 4 years now, 4.5, and I had 3% seems to be the number. So here's a question for you then, and I don't mean to be rude about it, but you're talking about a slowing down in the economy. Would you be frank and tell me did you predict the growth that we have had? No, right? Would you say that's an accurate statement that the growth that we have had coming out of the recession was greater than what you guys predicted? Would that be an accurate statement?
That's correct. The direction was right, the magnitude. I don't think that too many people predicted 6% GDP growth in the first quarter.
Right.
But you know what, that was, but maybe some.
I'll disagree a little bit. If you go back and compare, frankly, our forecast against the actual outcome for the last 2 years, we've been pretty close to spot on. But we've been seen as a bit of an optimistic forecaster.
Okay. And so anybody else want to comment on that?
The economy did bounce back very quickly from the recession. I didn't predict the 6% in Q1 or Q4 of 2009, but it is now slowing.
Right.
So when it's all said and done,
right.
The rate of growth for 2010 is going to be fairly close to what we had predicted before.
And I know you talked about consumption taxes, and you would admit you don't live in the political world. That's strictly economics assumptions that you're making that up. As you've seen what's happened in British Columbia, those who's had their heating bills gone up, it's a little bit different in the political world whether consumption taxes are acceptable or not. So is it possible then that the slowing down that and listen, our finance minister has been warning us every opportunity they have that the recovery is precarious and that we have to be careful and that the growth. So not that we disagree with you on that, but is it possible that the slowdown might not be as great as you predict?
I think in the short term, and by that I mean, say, the next 6 months, I'm afraid that the slowdown might be worse than what we think. Not because of what's going on here, but what's going on outside Canada. In the United States in particular, there are some very troubling developments. So the very short-term outlook, the next 6 months, I think could be even a little worse than what we say. Now, in the meantime, of course, the U.S. Federal Reserve will do something. They're talking about another wave of QE, of quantitative easing and all whatnot.
Right.
So there'll be further policy decisions on the fiscal side as well in the United States. So beyond, say, the first or second quarters of 2011, then we could see an acceleration. But very short term, I think it's weak.
Could you would you agree that that sometimes these things are self-fulfilling philosophies, or whatever the word is, the statement is? That if everyone talks around that things are slowing down, confidence goes down, consumer confidence goes down, investment goes down, and all of a sudden, hey, there's a slowdown.
Oh, certainly. Confidence, whether business or personal consumer confidence, is crucial. And yes, if there is an overall air of overly pessimistic opinions, then that has an impact. But still, underneath those pessimistic opinions, there's a reality. And in the U.S., that reality is twofold. Very high rates of unemployment and very weak personal balance sheets.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci. Monsieur Généraux, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. General, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to remind my colleague of the Bloc Québécois that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. When we talk about affordable housing, I think in the Canada's Economic Action Plan in the past 2 years, Mr. Généreux, I apologize. Mr. Généreux?
On my first day as chair, I completely I missed Mr. Pachetti. My apologies. Sorry. Sorry, you will be next after Mr. Pachetti. I'm sorry.
J'ai une meilleure question que toi, Bernard.
Mr. Pachetti for 5 minutes.
That's fine. I thought they were sharing time. Thank you to the witnesses. Thank you. Merci aux témoins pour être venus.
Thank you to the witnesses for appearing.
A little bit of a follow-up what Mr. Wallace was saying, but everybody's been talking about the debt, household debt, but let's talk about government debt. And I want to tie it into the domestic growth. We saw in the past 2 years, if we're off by even 1%, when I'm saying we, the government of Canada is off by 1%, it costs the fisc from $15 to $20 billion. And nobody's talking about the fact that we don't even know what our number is going to be. It keeps changing. I look at the department numbers for 2010 are predicted. They were originally predicted at 2.3. Now it's 2.6. The economists are coming in at around 3. Just that variance of 0.5 is going to cost the general fisc about $10 billion. Can I get your comments on that? And where are we going to get out of this mess? I think, Glenn, you addressed it initially and said that we should have a 3 to 5 year plan. But looking at what the numbers look like, I don't think we're going to get out of this anytime close.
Well, there's obviously multiple forces at play when it comes to federal revenues, and the business cycle itself is a driver. Another thing that we look at very carefully is the multiplier, how much revenue you're getting from every dollar of GDP, for example. And one of the things we saw before the recession was that higher income earners were paying more tax, and therefore we had more revenue than most of us were forecasting. Remember, we're all sort of 2002 to 2007, we were always surprised on the upside. And that was frankly a structural force you were seeing through the whole world. Under globalization, more income goes to higher earners. So we just saw the first 4 months of the federal numbers for this year, and they're pretty good. We've actually got pretty good revenue, notwithstanding the risks and the forces that my colleagues are talking about. So I don't quite know where it comes out, but I do know that I expect, in fact, revenues from higher income earners to actually be pretty good on a going forward basis, but I can't give you the number because we've just gone through a 2-year period where we've had great churn. But if it was only the business cycle, you're right. Slower growth will mean slower revenue and much more of a challenge to get back to a balanced budget.
Mr. Tall, I saw you were nodding your head.
Yes, I think that if you look at the first half of the year, we got $8 billion extra money just because of the fact that the economy was surprising on the upside. But you know what? Easy come, easy go. This money will not be available in the next 6 months because the economy will surprise on the downside. It's already happening. So you basically see that it's not so easy to maintain this kind of revenue stream, especially if we are right and this economy is going to slow down over the next 12 months. So yes, it's going to be a major challenge to collect this money given a slowing economy.
So what are we going to do in the next, how do we balance the budget over the next let's say a reasonable time period, say 3 to 5 years?
It's not going to be easy. I think it's doable, but it's not going to be easy. First of all, I think that the worst year will be the next 8 to 12 months. Beyond that, we are going to recover. We are going to basically see a situation in which the economy will gather momentum. At the same time, it will not be rising by 6 or 7% on a nominal basis, and therefore we have to be prudent there. And the only way to balance the budget is to make realistic assumptions and to budget according to them.
So what is the realistic assumption?
Well, I think that the realistic
So
assumption
if the
for GDP
forecasters,
growth,
if the independent, I got BMO here at 3, CIBC at 3%, Desjardins 3.1, RBC 3.3, and TD at 3, and then they revised. They were at 2.5, revised to 3.
yes, I think that for the next 12 months, a realistic number is around 2 to 2.5% real GDP, about 3.5 to 4% nominal GDP. Anything beyond that will be too risky. Beyond that, I think that a nominal GDP of roughly 5% is reasonable.
So that could potentially mean that the government numbers are off by $10 billion.
For the next 12 months, yes.
Okay, thank you. Quick question for you, Mr. Tall. In your presentation, you just you spoke about the percentage of our debt. I missed the part. The percentage of our debt based on what, and we're a little bit more dangerous to certain conditions here in Canada than elsewhere. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, I was talking about the sensitivity of consumers to higher interest rates, if that's what you're referring to. The debt-to-income ratio is 146%. It's a record high. The debt-to-income ratio.
Here in Canada?
Here in Canada. Within 6 months, we will be basically more or less where the U.S. is now. Now, this is not the main story because, of course, debt is the stock of debt and income is the flow of income, so you cannot compare them. But the number has been rising very quickly, reflecting a very effective monetary policy. The point that I'm making, and I think it's very important to understand, when we talk about this personal debt situation, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a wave of defaults tomorrow? Are we talking about subprime type situation? Or are we talking about a situation in which so many people are stretched and they simply will reduce their consumption in the future? I think that this is the situation. Namely, when interest rates go up, and they will go up eventually, you will see more people spending on debt and less on other things. This doesn't mean that everybody will default. We will not see a situation in which default rates will rise to the sky, but you'll see consumer spending slowing, and that's why I believe that the structural, if you would, speed limit of the economy will be reduced.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Ledo and Mr. Dupuis, si vous êtes d'accord avec ça.
I agree with what was just said. With regard to the budget and the balanced budget, I think the federal government's plan over 5 years is quite doable. So I wouldn't. But if interest rates or the debt rate increases, yes, we are vulnerable because the interest rates are abnormally low, and one day the rates will rise. Perhaps not in 2011, but in 2012, 2013. And at that time, there will be a shock. And that's what Mr. Carney repeated on a number of occasions. We have to prepare ourselves for the day when interest rates will come back to a more normal level. I believe the plan was quite conservative on the part of the government. And I think we're quite ahead of where we thought we'd be following the recession. And so if there's no derailment, I think we should reach a balanced budget as planned, and perhaps a year before schedule. But as was said today, there's a lot of risk in the environment out there, and so we have to be extremely careful over the next few years. Thank you. And now, Mr. Généreux, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll start over. I wanted to tell my colleague opposite that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can build social houses and buy aircraft, and the aircraft will be maintained in your riding. I'm surprised it's of no interest to you. You talked of a number of factors, namely with regard to exporters, and I drew a comparison with the potential financial stimulus. Mr. Dupuis, you talked about exporters on a number of occasions. Well, in fact, when you look at Canada's economic performance over the past few years, perhaps in the past 10 years, as a whole, the economy has done quite well, thanks to cleaning up of public finances. So interior economy has strengthened, but with regard to the export world, that sector has been hit hard. The Canadian dollar is a major factor. A number of Canadian exporters are having a hard time on a number of continents. We've seen a number of shutdowns. We've seen problems in other specific industries. And I think that's where the challenge lies. But even in some provinces like Quebec, the challenge is enormous. There's been a significant drop-off in terms of exports. And so I think we have to find a way to make our businesses more competitive. And I don't think we can go against the high level of the Canadian dollar. It is often through increased productivity, through investment in technology and machinery and equipment that can be done. And so basically I'm singing the same refrain for a while. That's basically the recipe that has to be followed, and it has to be indicated to businesses. And that's the export sector is the laggard at present. I have another question. Did you want to comment on that? No? Okay. We're currently being accused of reducing the corporate tax rate. I'd like to hear you about that. In terms of the recovery plan that we have to implement, and in terms of what has already been done.
To ongoing tax reform is important for the competitiveness of our economy. So the reductions in corporate income tax for me are an important piece of that in adapting to a world where the dollar is going to be more or less at par going forward. I mentioned very briefly before, though, I'm a bit troubled by one small thing in corporate income tax, the step from the small business tax rate up to the full corporate rate. I frankly think it's a barrier to growth for small companies. If you're going to be taxed at 5%, suddenly you're at 12 or whatever the rate is today. That actually can inhibit overall economic growth in our economy. So I'd like to see a step increase, but as a first principle, shifting the burden of taxation away from sort of earnings and investment towards consumption and carbon would be the right route for me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, as I mentioned, I think that it's not only the dollar, but other challenges that will make the life of SMEs in Canada very difficult over the next 2 to 3 years. We already lost ground during this recovery. Most of the job gains during this recovery was actually large corporations, not small businesses. I think that the dollar is part of it, and I think that the reduced propensity to export among SMEs is definitely a negative. And if we believe that the future is global, SMEs must be outside Canada and increase their export orientations, and cutting taxes might help doing so, given the very strong dollar.
J'ajouterais seulement que effectivement.
I'd simply add that, to echo my colleague's comment, we need to diversify our export markets. In Canada, we've forever exported to the U.S. Our SMEs are quite used to that, but we have to look elsewhere, to Asia, to Europe. And in this environment, the government has a role to play through its various agencies, whether it be EDC, BDC, and others, in order to support Canadian SMEs to export outside of North America. So you believe that the trade agreements that we are implementing is a good thing? Well, yes, I'm a great supporter of free trade. It's quite difficult for economists to sell the merits of free trade, but for us, it's almost intuitive. I understand, of course, there are political factors, but I think we should pursue a free trade. Mr. Dupuis? Thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask a question on tax policy and fiscal policy around deficit reduction. Do you view it as being during a time of high deficit, if you had a choice between putting the country back in surplus faster or cutting corporate taxes further, how would you respond to that? I mean, cutting corporate taxes during times of surplus, I think that with some exceptions to my left perhaps, most people would agree that a competitive corporate tax rate is a good thing. But the difference between cutting corporate taxes during surplus and cutting corporate taxes with borrowed money is a very, very different question. So I'd appreciate your views, given that any further corporate tax cut in the short term is going to be on borrowed money. Would it not make more sense to cut the deficit further and put us back into the black faster?
That's a very tough call because there's different forces at work, of course. The tax rate becomes an issue of really firm competitiveness. How do firms adapt to a dollar at par? And looking for ways to take pressure off them. But I'm also enough of a fiscal hawk. I mean, I spent 10 years of my life inside the Department of Finance, and I strongly believe in balanced budgets. So it's sort of Hobson's choice, frankly, for me, or maybe Hodgson's choice. I want both.
Well, you're at a great place to be. Those economists, those two hands,
That's why I've got them both working.
You were mentioning, Mr. Hodgson, that you would prefer a shift towards a carbon tax. I don't know where you were the last federal election, but in any case, that's another question. But and the other, you're saying you would support a shift towards consumption tax. So I'd appreciate your views on a policy to cut consumption tax on high carbon fuels.
Most well-trained economists believe that you have to get the price right on the benefits and what are called negative externalities of activity. So as a first principle, we should be trying to get the prices right. For me, that means actually taxing greenhouse gases. And frankly, governments that intervene in the price system are inviting trouble down the road. The longer you say freeze tax or freeze prices, lock in prices, you're going to have challenges at some point when you have to unfreeze that, and probably face as big a challenge at the end point as you are going in.
So any other comments on?
I was just going to say that from a very practical point of view, if you see what went on in British Columbia, I think BC was one of the first jurisdictions in North America to actually put in place a fairly intelligent carbon tax some years ago. The backlash against that was huge. So I don't know if the public is receptive. I've been saying now that yes, raise taxes, raise consumption taxes, but I appreciate that the practical problem of that, the Canadian public is perhaps not prepared. I mean, nothing rallies people more than to see the price of gasoline go up. Everybody goes nuts. And we all know that it should go even much higher than what it is now. So there is a very practical, real-life problem how politicians and political systems address that. But generally speaking, I think yes, we should be taxing carbon, we should be taxing consumption, and lower corporate income tax.
You have 1 minute, Mr. Bryson.
Just on the issue of, and Mr. Hodgson has an interest, I think, on the environmental side as well as the economic side. I'd appreciate your views on cutting taxes on, or cutting consumption taxes on high carbon energy from an environmental perspective.
Cutting taxes on high carbon energy is heading the wrong direction. Our economy is going to be more competitive over the long term if we get all the prices right, so both investors and consumers can take rational decisions based upon transparent, right prices. That's the right thing to do.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bryson. I just wanted to follow up on a few issues here. It was mentioned in your opening presentations that Canada has recovered all the jobs lost during the recession. That is not true, though, in the United States. And another challenge in the U.S. is that there's been a lack of earnings growth in the U.S. So I wanted you to address the earnings growth issue here in Canada as to what it has been and what do you expect it to be over the next 2 years.
Yeah, let me say,
Mr.
yes,
Tom?
we were able to recover all the jobs, but if you look at the distribution of those jobs, you can see that roughly 1/3 of all the jobs created during the recovery came from two sectors, construction and public sector. I think you don't have to be an economist to predict that those sectors will not create too many jobs over the next 12 months. So what we have seen is not only the number of jobs rising, but also the quality of employment rising significantly because those are high-paying jobs. I predict that over the next 6 to 12 months, you will see not only the number of jobs created in the economy slowing because you will not have construction jobs and public sector jobs, but also the quality of employment will go down. Therefore, I see income growth in Canada slowing in a very significant way. That's part of the reason why we believe that consumer spending in Canada will not rise in a very significant way.
Okay, anyone else?
Growth two different ways. We have a number built into our forecast, and we estimate that income will grow about 2.2, 2.3% balance of this year into 2011. We also do a survey that's not yet public, but we do a survey of about 500 large employers, public sector, private sector, and then come up with a number. Last year the number was 2.7%, which was higher than what we were forecasting. It's not a perfect survey, but we have a fairly good sense where the number is going to be going forward. And I wouldn't be surprised if that number is about 2.5% in 2011.
Okay. Monsieur Dupuis.
Well, excuse me.
Sorry, Monsieur Dupuis, and then...
Go ahead. Choking.
En fait,
Yes, it's true that the quality of jobs, and there are a lot of jobs that were created were part-time jobs. It's perhaps not the jobs that we would want necessarily, but there has been job creation. When you look in the U.S., the SMEs have not created jobs, and they're have to recover about 7 million jobs from pre-recession times. So yes, we are at risk, but we have recovered jobs, and that has contributed to increased consumption and people's incomes. And so, once again, that has distinguished us, but we are still at risk over the next couple of quarters and years. I would simply like to add that, yes, the Canadian labor market has done very well, and what's happening in the U.S. is a significant structural change, and we're not going through that. That's a good thing. But they're talking about structural unemployment. These are things that we don't talk about here or in the same way. So we're in a better position in that regard.
At least two more questions, so perhaps I'll put them on the table, see how much can be addressed. You talked about the debt and the quality of debt. I mean, one of the things that Canadians did during the recession period because of the low rates was to purchase homes. So and there was an article in the papers today with respect to should further government action be taken on housing to address the debt issue. I want to ask whether either any of you four think that we should do anything on the housing side. And then my next question would be with respect, you talked about the manufacturing sector. One of the things I've supported is changing capital cost allowance rates so you could write off capital quicker or equipment quicker. Now, a lot of economists say that's in fact a subsidy. It's a distortion of the economic life of an asset. You should not be doing that. The government, in fact, is moving away from accelerated CCA rates for the manufacturing sector. But I just want your views as economists. Do you see that as a subsidy? And whether you see it as a subsidy or not, is it something the government should look at going forward from the issue of addressing productivity and companies becoming more productive, but also upgrading the equipment and the processes they have within their facilities? So I've got about a minute, if we can just very quickly
okay, let me tackle the housing story, and then I'll let other people comment on the manufacturing. The housing market is slowing significantly. House prices are falling in everywhere, especially in the West, but also in Central Canada and Eastern Canada. I think this will continue. The market is already adjusting and taking care of the business. I don't think that the government at this point should introduce anything, given the fact that the economy is already slowing. Doing so will really cause major risk.
Okay. And Mr. Hodgson?
I'll answer your question by putting it this way. If I had to choose between extending the accelerated CCA rates and reducing corporate taxes, I would probably invest my money in accelerated CCA for a period of time, because it really does allow firms to then invest more in technology and the kind of things they're going to have to do right now to improve their productivity, if you have to choose.
Okay, I've got about 15 seconds.
Just very quickly, I would just, one of the surprises, one of the disappointments in Canada so far has been the poor performance of investment. Private investment hasn't been as strong as we thought it would be. So any sort of measure that would promote investment, even if it smells like a subsidy, might be welcome in the short term.
Okay. Merci. Thank you. Monsieur Mulcair, pour 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président.
Mulcair for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of Canada, recently gave free advice to Canadian chartered banks with regard to their own level of compensation and the number of executives, suggesting that they might want to cut down on for the first 9 months of the year. Canadian charter banks had $15 billion in profits. Of course, they're giving out bonuses to their executives to the tune of $7.5 billion. Mr. Letao, what do you think of Mr. Carney's intervention in that regard? Perhaps I'd leave my colleagues from the major banks. We of the small banks don't have that type of compensation, but I would, however, add it is true that Canadian banks are quite profitable, and that's something that has served us well. It has helped us make it through this crisis with a very stable financial context. And for each dollar of profit that is made, a lot is paid out in taxes, of course, and in other fees. So I think the banking sector greatly contributes to the Canadian coffers, or the public coffers. The question of high compensation levels is not an issue at our bank. We don't pay those high bonuses. We're not in the same league as my colleagues. Well, I'm sure in terms of your analyses, you're in the same league, but you're more modest. Mr. Tal, I'd like to come back to something you said just earlier. When I talked to you about reducing corporate tax rates for the most profitable corporations, and that can be done only if we can afford it. But can we?
At this point, for the next 12 months, I don't think we can afford it. I think given
you
the
do
fact,
or do not?
I don't think we can afford it. I think that given the fact that there is so much uncertainty, I will not change the system so quickly. I will allow monetary policy to do the work. I will allow interest rates to remain low, and if needed, actually to cut interest rates as the first wave of improving the economy. I will be very careful tackling the fiscal situation by cutting taxes at this point in time. My comment was from a long-term perspective, the medium term, but not for the next 12 months.
Good. Well, that's a very clear answer, and we're so unused to clear answers around this table. I want to say thank you. C'est bon, Monsieur le Président.
It's fine with me, Mr. Chair.
I want to go back to where we are and where we might be going. We have an aging society. Anticipating. Budgets generally don't, want to anticipate revenues, but they certainly want to provide for the expenses. But the aging society is becoming a major area of, say, for planning and investing. And I'm wondering whether or not, if you're going to suggest that we need to move into contingencies and other reserves like productivity reserves, that we should also start to identify the significant priorities that we should commit to now, because you can't flip a switch in the short term. In the real world, it takes years. I'd be interested in your comments about thinking ahead.
I agree with you entirely. I think the Quebec budget is very instructive in that. I mean, Quebec clearly faces a demographic challenge ahead of a lot of other provinces. And it was very clear as that budget was rolled out that they were thinking about the impact of slowing growth, of an aging workforce, and early retirements coming. Chris Reagan, by the way, there's an academic paper, I think it's in the IRPP policy options. Chris was a visiting scholar at the Department of Finance last year. It's just been a very good paper on demographics and fiscal impacts that might be useful for this committee to take a look at. We've done similar analysis. I think it's an excellent question.
Okay. With regard to international trade, whether it be China, India, Brazil, those kind of things, we've done Colombia, we're looking at, other countries. How much what should be our reasonable expectations of the role that enhanced free trade agreements with around the world will be part of the solution to getting us to that balanced budget, or is there a protracted period which does not follow our domestic activities? Is there a disconnect?
Well, I don't think trade automatically flows into fiscal policy, but I think trade is fundamental to our competitiveness going forward. We just put out a great paper, frankly, on Canada-EU trade, looking at how big it is, and in fact, reinforcing the case for a Canada-Europe free trade agreement as a way to ensure that we have access to other markets. I mean, there's as many consumers in Europe, in fact, more than there are in the United States, with comparable incomes. So broadening the number of free trade agreements we're negotiating and concluding the deal with Europe, we think is really critical to Canada's ongoing competitiveness.
All right. My last question has to do with the housing. It seems to be that Canadians can relate to a house and the cost of a house. And last week I saw there was a program, and they were talking about the high-priced house areas across the country, and indicating that a lot of Canadians have maxed out in terms of the carrying cost as a percent of their income. And in BC, I think it was as much as 75% of the income the family was bringing in was actually for carrying the house. This is a recipe for disaster, I would think, if we get a correction in the housing market. How bad could that be, given that we know what the experience has been in the United States?
That's a very good question. I think that the point that I made earlier, that we became very sensitive to higher interest rates, that's exactly what we are talking about. I do believe that house prices will fall, and that's a good thing, because I think that we need this kind of adjustment. I don't think that we are in a crash type situation like in the US, because for that you need extremely high interest rates and you need a subprime type situation, and we don't have these preconditions for a crash. I do see an adjustment in the housing market, and after that I see a housing market that will go nowhere for a long period of time.
Okay. Monsieur Dupuis?
Moi, je pense qu'on a comme dans beaucoup de marchés.
I think that, like in many markets, increases are done over a short period. I get the impression that the housing sector has increased greatly in the past few years, and now we've come to a point where, with regard to household income and people's revenue, we've come to a point where we can't go further. That's why I remain optimistic that the adjustment or the rebalancing will continue and that prices will remain stable for a number of years still. I don't see any crash, and I don't see any significant spike. I think we've caught up now, and things will be calmer for the next few years.
Oui.
Yes, we try to make as few mistakes as possible, and that's the art of the economist. Mr. Hodgson, I would ask you to be cautious, because you repeated this 2 or 3 times. If ever you come to Montreal, perhaps the price isn't right, because you've often mentioned that previously. In the time when Mr. Mulcair had mortgage problems in Quebec City, I was at the Department of Finance. And so, to reply in terms of anecdote, the strategist in chief of the Ministry of Finance said, listen, I told you so, but no one believed him at the time. And now we're in this context where no one believed in that 6% rise in GDP. I believe there's this term about the cyclical months. I think it takes a number of quarters in order to see an actual rise. Now, if a slowdown were to occur, but this is not something we are hoping for. Now, will it be 2%, 2.2%, 2.5%? That's not important. But let's say the slowdown does occur, that there's actually a slowdown, or worse yet, something that no one has mentioned for the past 2 hours, a deflation. If it's happened elsewhere, it could happen here. Now, let's say that we hypothesize. We hypothesize, yes. Perhaps if a conservative government, a hypothetical conservative government, would you agree that we'd need to adopt a interventionist policy, whether it be Keynesian, monetarist, or what have you? Would it not be, will we not be faced with a bad surprise if the government stubbornly continued to put the brakes on the economy? I think this is something that hasn't been mentioned, but I think my colleagues agree that the chances of a new recession in the U.S. are between 20 and 40%, and here in Canada it's perhaps 1 and 3%, between 20 and 40%. Regardless, it's quite high. If there is a new recession in the U.S., given the level of prices today, we could be seeing a certain disinflation or deflation, negative price increase. But I don't think it would be as what was seen in Japan. I think there would be other stimulus programs would have to come on board. I think the Fed has recently said that there would be some quantitative easing to stimulate the economy or to put a hold on the slowdown. So I wouldn't be as negative as you that we'd be seeing a deflation. I believe other major measures will be taken, but there is still a risk. There's still a risk. I'm not being pessimist. When you do risk management, portfolio management, you have to say that this might occur. Because 21% hit Thomas Mulcair with his mortgage one day, and these things might occur again. It's something that I learned in my economist studies. You should never say never. But these scenarios are not quite very probable. But the solution would be in international cooperation. We've seen central banks and governments, including the Canadian banks and the U.S. banks and the U.K. banks, worked together in a coordinated fashion. Now, if we see a new situation arising in 2011, the solution would be through international cooperation. So international cooperation would allow us to follow what's being done elsewhere, to identify tax havens, to shut them up, and therefore to ensure a greater tax revenues. That's one measure. There are other measures that could be taken. Yes, that would be something. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow up on some of the earlier questions that have been raised, with respect to real estate, Mr. Tal and Mr. Dupuis, you both said that you predict prices to come down, and then you said stagnation, you said stable. Can you just unpack that? Why? Why do you make those predictions? Is it a lack of income? Is it overexposure to personal debt?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the housing market in Canada, it has been booming basically for 10 years. So a lot of pent-up demand has been utilized. And then over the past year or 6 months, we have seen Canadians trying to beat the HST and basically have accelerated their purchasing, borrowing activity from the future. The future has arrived, which means that this is going to be a very non-linear recovery in the market. And that's why we believe that the first half of the year was very strong in the housing market, artificially strong, and now we're going to slow down. But after a peak, or after a boom of 10 years, you look at house prices vis-a-vis income, or vis-a-vis rent, or vis-a-vis demographics, and you can see that basically we're overshooting. And if we overshoot, it means that we have to go down. The only question is how quickly and how much, and that's why I say we are not crashing here because we don't have the preconditions for a crash, but we definitely have the conditions for a slowdown.
Would you add anything, Mr. Dupuis? Okay. My next question, speaking of the demographic slowdown that was mentioned, how do you see that unfolding? When we hear predictions about, tens, if not hundreds, if not more, removing themselves from the workforce in the next 10 to 15 years, what impact do you see that having on the Canadian economy, and what can be done to address that?
You want to Okay. Okay, go.
We do long-term forecasts going up to 2030 and basically show the slowing trend of labor force growth over that period. So the first symptom would be you see all the boomers getting ready to retire. They leave the workforce. They maybe work half-time, but you have a lot fewer hours worked. And overall labor force growth slows. And that, as Benjamin was saying, that has a deadening impact on your overall economic growth potential. And it's happening already. You can already see it happening in various parts of our economy. That's part of the reason why our unemployment rate didn't jump as high as in the last two recessions, is that employers were worried about the fact that they wouldn't be able to find new people in the recovery period which we're now in. But it's very evident, if you look at the demographics, we're going to have that slowing impact. We've seen it over the last 5 to 8 years. We're going to see it going forward now.
A shrinking economy?
It'll impact on the overall growth potential of our economy because labor force growth and therefore consumption growth is really a fundamental piece of an economy's growth potential.
And that's why immigration policy is crucial. I think that immigration quotas will be lifted over the next 10 years. That will be an economic reality in order to balance this pressure.
Maybe a bit of a note a little different on the question of demographics. We are assuming, and it's a honest assumption, that labor force participation rates will remain the same. By that I mean that a 65-year-old will behave the same way in 2015 as a 65-year-old did in 1950, meaning you would be glad to retire, to leave the labor force and go fishing or something. These days, I think that maybe is not a prudent assumption. I think a lot of people over 60 would like to remain in the labor force. And if that's the case, then perhaps the shock that Glenn alluded to won't be as severe. Now, for older people to stay in the labor force, we need some institutional changes to allow for that in terms of retirement age, retirement benefits. Some people might not pay to stay in the labor force if by doing that you're going to miss out on some pension payments. So that's a very, we should just not assume that a 65-year-old will behave the same way that his grandfather did.
Mm-hmm. Any comments on the U.S. debt levels that we're witnessing and the impact that will have on the Canadian economy?
I have a commentary sitting in my computer right now addressing that very issue, and I'll try and put it on our website or get it in one of the national newspapers in the coming weeks. But it's frankly shocking to see how quickly the U.S. federal debt has jumped from 60% of GDP to 80, hitting towards 100. The states are in horrible position. I was calling it a ticking time bomb. I think it's something we're really going to have to worry about. Unfortunately, we can't do much about it except sit back and watch. Maybe get our own act together, which we've already done.
Oui. Effectivement, on est très concerné.
Indeed, we're greatly concerned by the U.S. debt. However, that is one of the country with the where the tax rates are very, very low. We know that the Americans don't like taxes, but if one day or another they're at the end of their rope, a slight increase in their tax rate might perhaps reduce the level of indebtedness considerably. So you have to look at the problem from both sides. They have that advantage at present.
I want to thank Monsieur beaucoup vos présentations et vos.
Thank you for your presentations, your answers to our questions.
On an ongoing basis, Mr. Hodgson, you mentioned some reports. Please feel free at any time to forward those to the clerk, and we'll ensure all the members get them. But thank you so much for your time here today. Colleagues, I will suspend for a few minutes, and then we'll move on to Bill S3. Call our meeting back to order. Colleagues. Thank you. I'll just remind colleagues, clerks asked me to remind you we are at 1 Wellington tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. That is next to the Chateau Laurier.
New building.
The new building. And we... So we have an hour set aside for study of Bill S3, an act to implement conventions and protocols concluded between Canada and Colombia, Greece and Turkey for the avoidance of double taxation and the prevention of fiscal evasion with respect to taxes on income. We do have... we're...
Or can we move to doing?
We're expecting officials from the Department of Finance, but perhaps we'll follow Mr. Wallace's lead and just sense whether committee members do have questions or issues they wish to raise. My understanding is it's a very straightforward bill, and my understanding is the parties do not have too many questions, but if we can ask the officials to take a seat.
Thing was happening up here and wouldn't let us in.
And my understanding is the officials do not have an opening statement. Is that correct, Mr. Castonguay? There's no opening statement from the officials?
That's right.
That's correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we do have two officials from the Department of Finance. Mr. Pichetti.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I just would have a couple of standard questions. Would be, is there anything unusual in the bill that you would like to bring to our attention? That would be, I guess, the first question.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Could you please?
Sorry, yes. Is there anything in the bill that you would like to bring to our attention that would be unusual or different from other tax treaties?
These bills generally follow the OECD model and our own policy, which is patterned on after the OECD model. There are a few things that are different. I think one of them, for example, the taxation of non-resident business in treaties require a permanent establishment, that is a substantial presence from a business in the country. In some cases, other countries will insist that the provision of services without a permanent establishment is sufficient presence to warrant taxation. And in a couple, or I should in three of these treaties, we do have this provision that basically if someone comes to Canada for more than 6 months providing services, or go to the other country for more than 6 months, then it would be taxable in that country.
Okay, I guess the next question would be, why would this bill be introduced in the Senate rather than the House of Commons?
My understanding that with tax treaties, that's not unusual because it's not a revenue-raising bill. It only acts as a shield for taxpayers against taxation, so it can be introduced in the Senate.
Okay, just a quick question, I guess, on some of the technicalities. The rate of withholding on dividends, the rate of withholding on interest payments, the withholding on royalty, and the periodic pension payments. On the bottom four, interest payments, royalty, and periodic pensions are all the same, but when it comes to dividends, the rate is different for each country. Colombia and Greece, it's at 5%, and Turkey is at 15%. In all of the cases, the amount varies as well. I'm just wondering why that would be, and it wouldn't be standard for all treaty countries.
That's right. Our treaty policy is to insist on a rate of 5% for dividends when they are dividends from direct investment, usually defined in treaties as investment above either 10 or 15% equity position, and 15% for other dividends. In the case of Turkey, this is give and take negotiation. Their policy is to seek higher rates of withholding in countries with which they are perceived to import capital, and these are the rates that they have with comparable countries to us, like the UK, the US, and others.
So, Canada would be charging 15% and Turkey would be charging 15%?
That's right. No, the rate is bilateral, obviously.
It's bilateral.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pachetti. Mr. Carrier, avez-vous des questions?
No, merci.
No questions, Mr. Carrier? No. Mr. Mulcair?
Mr. Zabo, questions?
You've had an opportunity to prepare for this meeting, and I know that you have a nice briefing book. Is there anything there that you would like to suggest or bring to our attention related to this bill that may require some further discussion? Is there anything at all that you've detected in your preparation for this meeting?
As I said earlier, there are no tax treaties that are alike, but essentially they follow our policy. I mean, obviously withholding stands out in the case of Turkey. I've already talked about the provision of services. One other thing in there that is not major, where sometimes other countries will insist, is that in the case of the selling of insurance across the border, we would insist that it requires a permanent establishment to authorize taxation, but some of those countries prefer that simply the selling of insurance be sufficient to trigger taxation. So it is not in accordance with what we do, but it's part of the give and take of treaty negotiation. But by and large, those three conventions follow our model and the OECD model.
Okay. Is there a deadline or a sunset clause that the government is prescribing?
Treaties are in force as long as they are either terminated or amended. We have a network of 87 treaties. Some of them are quite old, and they require periodic revision. But these treaties are in force until they're terminated. Yeah.
Okay. And finally, in terms of the crafting of this particular bill and the provisions there, have we identified, in fact, areas in which previous legislation does not meet the same standard or requirements, and that would require amendments to be recommended to the government?
The reason that these treaties are enacted as legislation is so that they can override the Income Tax Act. And so where each of these treaties and the legislative provisions enacting them specifically provide that where there's a conflict between the Income Tax Act and the provisions of the treaty governs, and that's why they're enacted as legislation.
Thank you. That's helpful. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Zabo. Monsieur Mulcair, s'il vous plaît.
Brièvement, puisque M. Castonguay...
Briefly, since Mr. Castonguay touched upon this, he explained that even though no tax treaties are the same, there are always adjustments that are made, and that's why we have to engage in such exercises. He referred to a certain structure or a model that exists. I wanted to ask him whether, following his analysis, I'm thinking of human rights, namely with regard to Colombia and whole issues regarding that. Well, treaties were negotiated, and we asked for opinions from the Department of Foreign Affairs on such issues. With regard to Colombia, the Department of Foreign Affairs believed and was of the opinion that it would be desirable to have a tax treaty given the level of trade between our two countries. And that's all I can say. Thank you. I understand the difference between your work and mine, and I didn't want to press on that further. Mr. Carrier, please. Thank you. Mr. Castonguay, I'd like to speak to you because you're Francophone. Now, the political side of this bill, this deals with the tax evasion, and I think that whole issue will be addressed through the adoption of this bill. This is something that has been denounced. There has been a lot of tax revenue that has been lost because of tax evasion. Do you believe that with such a bill, Canada will recover monies that have been lost through tax evasion? Well, indeed, one of the main reasons for these tax treaties is to put a stop to tax evasion. Under the tax treaties, you have mechanisms for information exchange whereby the CRA can approach the various government bodies of the other countries and ask for information about people who do not meet their fiscal needs. Therefore, if the agency believes there are people who do not respect their responsibilities, the CRA can approach the various organizations in other countries. And this is according to the OECD model on information exchange. Now, for these 3 countries which were included in this bill, would the issue of tax evasion be resolved through this bill, or only a part of that problem? So, would other programs need to be implemented to address that? Well, tax evasion is difficult to counter because it goes under the radar. We don't necessarily have all the information. Tax treaties provide us with an instrument whereby we can approach another country in the instance where we believe that there are organizations that have relevant information that address gaps in our own domestic information. But this will facilitate the work of the CRA, definitely.
Monsieur le Président, juste deux questions rapides.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 brief questions. First of all, is this the first time we sign a treaty or a convention with those 3 countries? Yes, this is the first time we have an agreement with those 3 countries. This bill will be adopted, it will be implemented, it will come into force. Now, do those countries have to do the same before the bill can be implemented? Yes, I do have some information on that. Indeed, each of the 3 countries also have to ratify these treaties according to their internal procedures. With regard to Greece, now, Greece has completed its process and is ready to ratify the treaty. With regard to Colombia, its Senate has adopted the convention at the end of September and is headed to the House of Representatives there for debate. And in the case of Turkey, the Committee of Foreign Affairs in the Turkish Parliament studied it, and it will move to its General Assembly. And so in the last 2 incidents, I believe the ratification will be done before the end of the year. Yes, all countries have to ratify for the convention to come into force. So up until this date, we've never had a tax treaty with Greece. Yes, this is the first time we have such a treaty with Greece. It's kind of an anomaly because Greece is part of the OECD, and negotiations took quite some time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Clause by clause consideration of Bill S3. Just pursuant to Standing Order 75-1, consideration of Clause 1 is postponed. Mr. Wallace.
Can I move Clause 2, 3, and 4 to be moved all at the same time?
Okay. Shall Clause 2, 3, and 4 carry? Agreed. D'accord. Shall Schedule 1 carry? D'accord. So Schedule 2 carry? Agreed. Schedule 3 carry? Shall the short title carry? Agreed. Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? Agreed. Shall the chair report the bill to the House? D'accord. Okay. See.
I notice a motion on this.
No, we will discuss your motion. I believe Mr. Bryson's motion's on Wednesday. That's my
So this is a notice, handing this out, it's notice of motion for Wednesday, right?
Well, if it's submitted to the clerk, it's notice.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. We will see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Merci.
While the colleagues are still here,
sorry.
Can we ungavel?
Yeah, I will ungavel.
For a nanosecond?
I'll just, I think we're, well, thank the officials from the Department of Finance. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate
dismissed.
that.
The day and one of us says, you can all scream at us.
Mr. Menzies?
Thank you, Thomas, for reminding me. I was so excited that we were getting out of here before 6:30. There's some more names that we as a group, all party, would like to suggest for pre-budget. The one I would like to put forward is Special Olympics. Somehow we neglected to get them on our list, so I'd like to ask for unanimous support that the Special Olympics group be allowed to.
I'm not opposed to any one group. Last fall, to be blunt, I had members coming to me and saying there were too many meetings. We've added a motion today which is going to add meetings. I'm not opposed to adding any more witnesses. Anytime though a witness is added, I want it to be very clear that means the chair will add meetings upon meetings in this fall for pre-budget hearings. We have about 430 who have submitted. 155 are now on the list. We're going to be adding more. I'm not opposed to that. I'm just saying let's be cognizant and let's not beat up the chair when names are added, because the consequence of adding names to the list is more meetings. And so I'm fine with that if committee members do that with the knowledge that I will add meetings. Mr. Menzies, is that?
Thomas and I have
Mr. Mulcair?
We're both in a very delicate situation because in both cases there was a group that thought that they were going to be on it, just slipped through the cracks. I agree with his suggestion. 2 more out of 155, I think we can understand it's not going to add a heck of a lot of meetings. And I have one which is number 122. I'm always reading from the French list, which is Alliance Canadienne Féministe pour l'Action. This is the English list. Canadian Feminist Alliance for International Action. We would have liked to have heard from them. For some reason, the way the list got put together too quickly, we missed one. I take full responsibility for that, and I apologize to the colleagues. But if we could see our way free to allow Ted's to be added and mine, it would make, I think, an important contribution to our work.
Okay, we've taken note of the 2 names. I have Mr. Pachetti.
Yes, we'd like to add 4 additional names, 5. The Canadian Nurses Association, Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, Pembina Institute, Canadian Clean Technology, and Canadian research-based pharmaceutical companies, RxND.
We're for it. I mean,
Okay, thank you. Monsieur Paillet, s'il vous plaît.
I don't want people to prevent from leaving, but people told us that, oh, well, you didn't retain our group, and we said no because there was a certain procedure whereby you had to send briefs by August 15th. And again today, people from the Saint Jean riding have told us that's unfortunate, but if we start adding groups left and right, I'll be coming up with my own list. I know, but at one point, people have to wake up and we have to stick to the rules. No, I don't want to add groups, but I think we have our list, and I think we should stick to it. You can do what you want, but I disagree with this way of doing things.
Adopt the names today, but my suggestion, frankly, is we set some time aside, perhaps later this week, to just have an in-camera discussion, because, frankly, if these names are added, our offices are going to get flooded with calls from now on in saying...
Monsieur le Président, je pense que M. Paillet vient de m'indiquer.
Chair, I think Mr. Paillet has just indicated that he agrees. I agree with the Liberals list. I agree with Mr. Menzies' suggestion. I can go with that. But I think we should settle this once and for all now. And if there are other requests, well, then we can explain the process.
I agree with your recommendation of having a further steering committee address this issue. we've had to give the unfortunate news that not all the groups that would like to present to this committee weren't on the list, and now if we're going to open it up again, the obligation on our offices is going to be to revisit the requests that we've received since the deadline. So I really encourage you to gather the steering committee and reevaluate this question, because once the door opens, then we all have an obligation to go back to the groups that asked to be here, and we're not admitted the first time around.
Okay, thank you. I have Monsieur Payet.
Oui,
Well, along the same lines, given that what happened last week with us having to come back to vote, could the days that were planned to travel out east perhaps be used to hold hearings here, and so we could make some time that way? Well, perhaps we could talk about that in the steering committee.
I have a steering committee or subcommittee, but it's up to the committee as to whether they want to do that or not. But that's my suggestion. I think we could find agreement on who to add or who not to add. But I also then would want the approval of the subcommittee as to what kind of agenda we're putting forward, because we are going to have to add more meetings. Mr. Pichetti?
I would say that we did not exclude any of the witnesses. Like the chair said, we have 430 witnesses. It's who we decide to have come. There were some, it's the first time we do this, so it's not scientific, and that's what I've been telling the people I've been speaking to. I think if there was, an amicable agreement that we add 6 people, I think that's what we're saying here. But if we need to have a steering committee, I would suggest we have it tomorrow afternoon, 3:30 to 4, and we agree. But then we have to bring it to the full committee, and that means Wednesday, and the clerk has got to do some planning. It's not meant to reopen the number of witnesses. The idea is, Ted, I think we have in total six additional people.
Well, if the 4 parties are fine with the names mentioned, I mean, that's fine with me. Okay. Mr. Mulcair, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, fine. Okay.
Okay. We're okay with the names that were, okay. D'accord? So all right. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.